I've decided for Halloween to read Nikolai Gogol's V story, and I will be hopping around from translations. First is Constance Garnett. V, and this is a footnote. V is a colossal creation of the popular imagination. It is the name among the Little Russians for the chief of the gnomes, whose eyelids droop down to the earth. This whole story is folklore. I was unwilling to change it, and I tell it almost in the simple words in which I heard it. Parentheses, in Gogol, end of parentheses. And then in brackets, the editor has added, Gogol probably never heard it at all. No discovery has been made of the folklore source of V. End of editor's brackets. As soon as the rather lilting seminary bell which hung at the gate of the Bratsky Monastery rang out every morning in Kiev, schoolboys and students hurried there in crowds from all parts of the town. Students of grammar, rhetoric, philosophy, and theology trudged to their classrooms with exercise books under their arms. The grammarians were very small boys. They shoved each other as they went along and quarreled in a shrill alto. They almost all wore muddy or tattered clothes, and their pockets were full of all manner of garbage, such as knuckle bones, whistles made of feathers, or a half-eaten pie, sometimes even little sparrows, one of whom, suddenly tweeting at an exceptionally quiet moment in the classroom, would cost its owner some sound whacks on both hands and sometimes a thrashing. The rhetoricians walked with more dignity. Their clothes were often quite free from holes. On the other hand, their faces almost all bore some decoration. Either one eye had sunk right under the forehead, or there was a monstrous swelling in place of a lip, or some other disfigurement. They talked and swore among themselves in tenor voices. The philosophers conversed an octave lower in the scale. They had nothing in their pockets but strong, cheap tobacco. They prepared no provisions of any sort, but ate on the spot anything they came across. They smelled of pipes and vodka to such a distance that a passing workman would sometimes stop a long way off and sniff the air like a hound. Now we'll switch to Paveer Velikonsky and take it from the top, as they say. V, and here's the footnote. V is a colossal creation of folk imagination. This name is applied by people in Little Russia to the chief of the gnomes, whose eyelids reach to the ground. The whole story is a popular legend. I did not wish to change it in any way and tell it almost as simply as I heard it. Parentheses, author's note, end of parentheses. As soon as the booming seminary bell that hung by the gates of the Bratsky Monastery in Kiev rang out in the morning, crowds of schoolboys and seminarians came hurrying from all over the city. Grammarians, rhetoricians, philosophers, and theologians, notebooks under their arms, trudged to class. The grammarians were still very small. As they walked, they pushed each other and quarreled among themselves in the thinnest trebles. Their clothes were almost all torn or dirty, and their pockets were eternally full of various sorts of trash, such as knuckle bones, whistles made from feathers, unfinished pieces of pie, and occasionally even a little sparrow that, by chirping suddenly amidst the extraordinary silence of the classroom, would procure for its patron a decent beating on both hands. And sometimes the cherrywood rod. The rhetoricians walked more sedately. Their clothes were often perfectly intact, but instead their faces were almost always adorned with some rhetorical trope, one eye completely closed, or a big bubble instead of a lip, or some other mark. These swore by God and talked among themselves in tenors. The philosophers dropped a whole octave lower. There was nothing in their pockets except strong, coarse tobacco. They kept nothing stashed away and ate whatever came along on the spot. The smell of pipes and vodka sometimes spread so far around them that a passing artisan would stand for a long time, sniffing the air like a hound. Now we go to somebody named Christopher English, who I've never heard of before, but we'll hear how he deals with the opening paragraph. V. And here's the footnote. V, a remarkable product of the popular imagination. This is the name given by the Ukrainians to the king of the gnomes, whose eyelids hang right down to the ground. This entire story is a folk legend. Not wanting to change it in any way, I tell it in almost as simple form as that in which I heard it. Parentheses, author's note, end of parentheses. In Kiev every morning, the moment the first chimes were heard from the loud seminary bell which hangs by the gates of the Bratsk monastery, crowds of school children and seminarists could be seen hurrying from all corners of the city. The 4 grades of the seminary, grammarians, rhetoricians, philosophers, and theologians scurried, exercise books under their arms, into their classes. The grammarians were still very small. As they walked along, they jostled one another and squabbled in piping treble voices. They were nearly all wearing tattered and grubby clothes, and their pockets were invariably filled with all sorts of rubbish, such as knuckle bones, whistles made from feathers, half-eaten pies, and sometimes even fledgling sparrows, one of which would suddenly shatter the eerie hush in the classroom with a chirrup, earning its patron several smart blows with a ruler, and sometimes a thrashing with cherry rods. The rhetoricians were more sedate. Their clothes were often in good repair, but then they nearly always sported on their faces some embellishment or other akin to a rhetorical trope. Either one eye was almost obscured by a swollen brow, or in place of a lip they had an enormous blister, or some other such marking. These talked and cursed at one another in tenor voices. The philosophers boomed a full octave below them. Their pockets contained nothing except for rough-cut tobacco. They carried no provisions about with them and would eat everything they could get their hands on there and then. Sometimes they reeked so strongly of pipe tobacco and vodka that an artisan walking past in the distance would stop and for a long time sniff the air like a hunting dog. I'm going to go back to Pavel Volokonsky and continue until I see anything that I want to check, any other translations. The marketplace at that time was usually just beginning to stir, and women with bagels, rolls, watermelon seeds, and poppy seed cakes tugged those who had them by their coattails of thin broadcloth or some sort of cotton. I'm already going to go on, check the Constance Garnett, because I didn't exactly understand it here. As a rule, the market was just beginning to stir at that hour, and the women with pretzels, rolls, melon seeds, and poppy cakes would tug at the skirts of those whose coats were of fine cloth or some cotton material. All right, so if they thought they had money, they would tug at them. But that was Constance Garnett. Now I'm going back to Pavel Volokonsky. I'm going to read it again. The marketplace at that time was usually just beginning to stir, and women with bagels, rolls, watermelon seeds, and poppy seed cakes tugged those who had them by their coattails of thin broadcloth or some sort of cotton. See, this is Pavel Volokonsky, and the Constance Garnett seems to point out that the saleswomen were tugging on the coats of the kids that looked like they had some money. Young sirs, here, here, they said on all sides. There are good bagels, poppy seed cakes, twists, rolls, fine ones, by God, with honey, homemade. Another woman holding up something long made of twisted dough cried, "Here's an icicle, young sirs, buy an icicle." I have to go and see what the translation is in Garnett. What the hell is an icicle? Another woman, lifting up a sort of long twist made of dough, would cry, "Here's a pretzel. Buy my pretzel, young gentleman." Yeah, pretzel, that makes sense. Icicle. I don't understand, like, why would somebody put an icicle if it's a pretzel? Let's do Christopher English just for fun. Another, lifting into the air some long and twisted object made from dough, shouted, "See this nice crinkle stick, young sirs? Buy my crinkle sticks." I'm going to continue with Christopher English just for fun. "Don't buy anything from that one. Just look at her nose, and her hands are filthy." But they were afraid to importune the philosophers and theologians, because philosophers and theologians never did more than sample their wares and always helped themselves to entire handfuls. When they reached the seminary, the entire crowd disappeared into their respective classrooms, these being low-ceilinged, but fairly spacious, with small windows, broad doors, and ink-stained benches. The classes would suddenly fill with the buzzing of many voices as the auditors tested their pupils, the ringing treble of a grammarian would be exactly attuned to the ringing of the glass panes in the small window, and the glass would respond with almost exactly the same ringing sound. In one corner droned a rhetorician, whose mouth and thick lips should at least have qualified him for the status of philosopher. He droned in a deep bass, and from afar all that could be heard was boom, 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 boom. The auditors taking the lesson would let one eye roam beneath the bench, where they could see protruding from the pocket of a subordinate seminarist a roll or a veronic or some pumpkin seeds. I'm going to go to Constance Garnett and see how she renders that roll and pumpkin seeds. On reaching the seminary, the crowd dispersed to their various classes, which were held in low-pitched but fairly large rooms with little windows, wide doorways, and dirty benches. The classroom was at once filled with all sorts of buzzing sounds. The, quote, auditors, end of quote, heard their pupils repeat their lessons. The shrill alto of a grammarian rang out, and the window pane responded with almost the same note. In a corner, a rhetorician, whose mouth and thick lips should have belonged at least to a student of philosophy, was droning something in a bass voice, and all that could be heard at a distance was boo, boo, boo. The, quote, auditors, end of quote, as they heard the lesson, kept glancing with one eye under the bench, where a roll or a cheesecake or some pumpkin seeds were peeping out of a scholar's pocket. When this learned crowd managed to arrive a little too early, or when they knew that the professors would be later than usual, then by general consent they got up a fight, and everyone had to take part in it, even the monitors whose duty it was to maintain discipline and look after the morals of all the students. Two theologians usually settled the arrangements for the battle, whether each class was to defend itself individually or whether all were to be divided into two parties, the bursars and the seminarists. That goes down to a footnote which reads, both bursars and seminarists studied for the priesthood. Bursars were partly sponsored by the government and partly by private donations. They lived on the premises of the seminary. Seminarists were fully sponsored by the state and did not necessarily reside on the premises. In any case, the grammarians, this is back to the story. In any case, the grammarians first began the attack, and as soon as the rhetoricians entered the fray, they ran away and stood at points of vantage to watch the contest. Then the devotees of philosophy with long black mustaches joined in, and finally those of theology, very thick in the neck and attired in shocking trousers, took part. It commonly ended in theology beating all the rest, and the philosophers, rubbing their ribs, would be forced into the classroom and sat down on the benches to rest. The professor, who had himself at one time taken part in such battles, could, on entering the class, see in a minute from the flushed faces of his audience that the battle had been a good one, and while he was caning a rhetorician on the fingers, in another classroom another professor would be smacking philosophy's hands with a ruler. The theologians were dealt with in quite a different way. They received, to use the expression of a professor of theology, quote, a peck of peas apiece, end of quote. In other words, a liberal drubbing with short leather thongs. I'm now going to read a couple of, this is meant to be an exhaustive Halloween terrorization of the story V. So now I'm going to read some critical writing about it. And this is in the introduction to the collection. Leonard J. Kent has written this introduction. And this is the small amount that he says about V. Just a couple of short paragraphs. V, which also belongs to the earlier Gogol tradition, to quote from Gogol's footnote, quote, is a colossal creation of the popular imagination. It is basically a horror story infused with humorous elements. The prosaic and the realistic. It is basically a horror story infused with humorous elements, the prosaic and the realistic. That the story is at all successful bespeaks the singular ability of the author to mingle such diverse elements into something of a cohesive whole. At times, the story seems to be melodramatic Poe that frightens less than it irritates. The realistic and comic descriptions of the seminary and its students are superior to the Gothic framework, but V and his ghoulish cohorts are so horrible that they cease being monsters. They are made of pasteboard. As no discovery has ever been made of the alleged folklore source of this, quote, colossal creation of the popular imagination, end of quote, it is a fascinating document, and close examination of text reveals how many of Gogol's fears are here projected. Demonic woman, the threatened church, his soul, what the psychoanalyst would refer to as the imago, the unconscious infantile conception of parents. All right, let's continue with Constance Garnett. On holidays and ceremonial occasions, the bursars and the seminarists went from house to house as mummers. Sometimes they acted a play, and then the most distinguished figure was always some theologian, almost as tall as the belfry of Kiev, who took the part of Herodias, or Potiphar's wife. This is a footnote. Herodias was the wife of Herod, ruler of Palestine at the time of Christ's death. Potiphar's wife falsely accused Joseph of attempting to seduce her. Genesis 39, and that was an editor's note. Now back to the story. They received in payment a piece of linen, a sack of millet, or half a boiled goose, or something of the sort. All in this crowd of students, the seminarists as well as the bursars, with whom they maintained a hereditary feud, were exceedingly badly off for means of subsistence, and at the same time had extraordinary appetites, so that to reckon how many dumplings each of them had tucked away at supper would be utterly impossible, and therefore the voluntary offerings of prosperous citizens could not be sufficient for them. Then the, quote, synod, end of quote, of the philosophers and theologians dispatched the grammarians and rhetoricians under the supervision of a philosopher, who sometimes took part in the raid himself, with sacks on their shoulders to plunder the vegetable gardens, and pumpkin porridge was made in the bursars' quarters. The members of the, quote, synod, end of quote, ate such masses of melons that the next day their, quote, auditors, end of quote, heard 2 lessons from them instead of one coming from their lips, another muttering in their stomachs. Both the bursars and the seminarists wore long garments resembling frock coats, quote, prolonged to the utmost limit, end of quote, a technical expression signifying below their heels. The most important event for the seminarists was the coming of the vacation. It began in June when they usually dispersed to their homes. Then the main road was dotted with philosophers, grammarians, and theologians. Those who had nowhere to go went to stay with some comrade. The philosophers and theologians took a situation, that is, undertook the tutoring of the children in some prosperous family and received in payment a pair of new boots or sometimes even a coat. The whole crowd trailed along together like a gypsy encampment, boiled their porridge, and slept in the fields. Everyone hauled along a sack in which he had a shirt and a pair of leg wrappers. The theologians were particularly careful and precise. To avoid wearing out their boots, they took them off, hung them on sticks, and carried them on their shoulders, particularly if it was muddy. Then, tucking their trousers up above their knees, they splashed fearlessly through the puddles. When they saw a village, they turned off the main road, and going up to any house that seemed a little better looking than the rest, stood in a row before the windows and began singing a chant at the top of their voices. The master of the house, some old Cossack villager, would listen to them for a long time, his head propped on his hands. Then he would sob bitterly and say, turning to his wife, "Wife, what the scholars are singing must be very profound. Bring them bacon and anything else that we have." And a whole bowl of dumplings was emptied into the sack. A big piece of bacon, several flat loaves, sometimes a trussed hen, would go into it too. Fortified with such supplies, the grammarians, rhetoricians, philosophers, and theologians went on their way again. Their numbers lessened, however, the further they went. Almost all wandered off toward their homes, and only those were left whose paternal homes were further away. Once, at the time of such a migration, 3 students turned off the main road in order to replenish their store of provisions at the first homestead they could find, for their sacks had long been empty. They were the theologian Kaliava, the philosopher Koma Brut, and the rhetorician Tiberi Gorobets. The theologian was a tall, broad-shouldered fellow who had an extremely odd habit. Anything that lay within his reach he invariably stole. In other circumstances he was of an excessively gloomy temper, and when he was drunk he used to hide in the rank grass, and the seminarists had a lot of trouble finding him there. The philosopher Koma Brut was of a cheerful temper. He was very fond of lying on his back, smoking a pipe. When he was drinking, he always engaged musicians and danced the trepik. He often had a taste of the, quote, peck of peas, end of quote, but took it with perfect philosophical indifference. saying that there's no escaping what has to be. The rhetorician, Tiberi Gorobets, had not yet the right to wear a mustache, to drink vodka, and to smoke a pipe. He only wore a curl around his ear, and so his character was as yet hardly formed. But judging from the big bumps on the forehead with which he often appeared in class, it might be presumed that he would make a good fighter. The theologian, Kaliava, and the philosopher, Koma, often pulled him by the forelock as a sign of their favor, and employed him as their messenger. It was evening when they turned off the main road. The sun had only just set, and the warmth of the day still lingered in the air. The theologian and the philosopher walked along in silence, smoking their pipes. The rhetorician, Tiberi Gorobets, kept knocking off the heads of the wayside thistles with his stick. The road ran between scattered groups of oak and nut trees standing here and there in the meadows. Sloping uplands, little hills, green and round as cupolas, were interspersed here and there about the plain. The fields of ripening wheat, which came into view in two places, showed that some village must soon be seen. However, it was more than an hour since they had passed the wheat fields, and still they had come upon no dwelling. The sky was now completely wrapped in darkness, and only in the west was there a pale streak left of the glow of sunset. "What the hell does it mean?" said the philosopher Koma Brute. It looked as though a village would appear in a minute. The theologian did not speak. He gazed at the surrounding country, then put his pipe back in his mouth, and they continued on their way. "I swear," the philosopher said, stopping again, "not even the fist of a devil is to be seen." "Maybe some village will turn up further on," said the theologian, not removing his pipe. But meantime, night had come on, and a rather dark night it was. Small storm clouds increased the gloom, and by every sign they could expect neither stars nor moon. The students noticed that they had lost their way and for a long time had been walking off the road. The philosopher, after feeling about with his feet in all directions, said at last abruptly, "Where's the road?" The theologian did not speak for a while. Then, after pondering, he said, "Yes, it is a dark night." The rhetorician walked off to one side and tried on his hands and knees to feel for the road, but his hands came upon nothing but foxes' holes. On all sides of them there was the steppe, which, it seemed, no one had ever crossed. The travelers made another effort to press on a little, but there was the same wilderness in all directions. The philosopher tried shouting, but his voice seemed completely lost on the steppe and met with no reply. All they heard was, a little afterward, a faint moaning like the howl of a wolf. "What are we to do?" said the philosopher. "Why, stop and sleep in the open," said the theologian, and he felt in his pocket for flint and tinder to light his pipe again. But the philosopher could not agree to this. It was always his habit at night to put away a quarter loaf of bread and 4 pounds of bacon, and he was conscious on this occasion of an insufferable sense of loneliness in his stomach. Besides, in spite of his cheerful temper, the philosopher was rather afraid of wolves. "No, Kaliava, we can't," he said. "What? Stretch out and lie down like a dog without having eaten anything? Let's make another try for it. Maybe we'll stumble on some dwelling place and get at least a drink of vodka for supper." At the word vodka, the theologian spat to one side and said, "Well, of course, it's no use staying in the open." The students walked on, and to their intense delight, they caught the sound of barking in the distance. Listening which way it came from, they walked on more boldly, and a little later saw a light.